Alright, away we go. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, this week's foray into white collar law, otherwise known as the Fcpa. This law has a history to it. It was a result of the scandal where during such time the government found that many major corporations were keeping slush funds available to themselves, not on the books. That's a key to understanding this law, not on the books of the company, but they were nevertheless, as it sounds, slush funds. They were funds kept elsewhere, not in their name, but available for use in paying bribes to public officials, both in the United States and outside. This particular law did not direct itself to bribes paid in the United States. It applied to bribes being paid by U.S. companies to companies not in the United States, which will mark as FX. This particular type of bribe takes place off the shores of the United States, or at least with entities off the shores of the United States. The bribe could happen here, but it's directed to foreign, not companies, but foreign officials, and perhaps companies. We'll see why. So when we get into the detail, we'll find out that Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is directed against U.S. companies or foreign companies for making bribes to officials, government officials, but that can apply to companies, foreign companies as well. We'll find out. Okay, stay tuned. All right. The reason for covering it is not just because it's a act against white collar crime, corruption, but also because it's a big moneymaker for the U.S. government. The fines that have been levied using this particular law have yielded the United States government lots of money. For example, well, this is just telling you what I just said. That against non-U.S. companies, and the law applies to non-U.S. companies, have resulted in some of the largest financial settlements in U.S. history. Now, you may be asking, how is the United States law able to levy fines against a non-U.S. company? And that answer is forthcoming as well. So now you have two reasons to stay tuned. Okay, here we go. Here's another example of a huge fine bringing in a lot of money. A Brazilian company called Petrobras, in 2018. It's very recent, as you can see. So 1.78 billion to the United States and Brazilian governments settle allegations that they pay huge amounts in bribes to Brazilian politicians. So you're beginning to see the elements that we're about this is, first of all, it has to be a bribe. It's not usually, but it's always to some foreign government. Here in this case, it was directly to Brazilian politicians. We also are seeing that even though the law has jurisdiction to companies outside the United States for such bribes, there may even be laws in that particular country where the company, once discovered, can be facing not just one lawsuit prosecution from the U.S. in this case, but also from their home country at the same time. So this is a Brazilian company. They were guilty of making a bribe to Brazilian officials, Brazilian government officials, and so they faced sort of a double jeopardy, a legal double jeopardy in this case, where the U.S. had jurisdiction against Petrobras, and so did the Brazilian government, and it yielded a lot of money. Okay, billion. All right, more than 400 U.S. companies have also paid fines based on contributions by the United States government for failure to, or I shouldn't say failure. Yeah, there's a failure, an ethical failure, but for violating the Fcpa, and therefore that's another source of a lot of money to the U.S. government from fines levied against these companies. Now, the way it works legally, I don't think you need to know this one because but it's just of interest. The jurisdiction applies to both the Department of Justice, which can bring criminal charges, and the Securities and Exchange Commission can pursue civil penalties. So I think we need to stop this to understand this, help understand the scope of the law and some of the things I've been alluding to. The Department of Justice administers criminal statutes, so it would prosecute under criminal law. You violate the law, they're going to try to convict you of that if they know about it. The Securities Exchange Commission, on the other hand, although a department of the Department of Justice, is the organization that oversees the stock markets in the United States. So the publicly traded companies that list their stock markets within the United States, the SEC has the big burden job of making sure that those markets are run properly, the companies are behaving themselves fairly, that they're reporting the results of their operations fairly. That's a huge responsibility. Part of the action publicly held company stocks are probably the best in the world, which is one of the things that makes the United States a great place for businesses to come here and, even if they don't do business, but to at least raise capital here through our stock markets. So, the result of this, the Securities and Exchange Commission has the right to pursue violations of this law in a civil case, saying that, hey, you've made my job difficult to do, you've damaged my ability to keep the markets clean. You already are being prosecuted criminally by the Department of Justice, but I've been damaged. My marketplace has been damaged. The market that I'm overseeing. All right, let's move along. Further down the line, here we go. Now, few reported cases are actually interpreted in the court system. So in other words, we have few court opinions on how the law is to be interpreted. Usually, laws are written in a language, in this country in English, but English can be fickle, trying to interpret what words mean. Sometimes the writing is clear, sometimes they're not so, and so courts have the job of determining what does the law mean. So if someone feels that they didn't violate the language of the law, they may defend themselves by saying, let's go to court and have the courts decide who's right. Did I really break the law based on the way it's written, or maybe interpret the language of the law. So that's, when we say interpret, we mean the language of the law. In this case, because the fines are so huge, many companies decide they'd rather settle the cases before going to court and run the risk that the actual criminal case be sustained and the penalty be even greater than they thought they might be able to do by a plea bargain with the Department of Justice. So that's usually what happens in most cases, because the fines can be so huge, they end in some kind of settlement. You might call it a plea bargain, where they make a deal with the Department of Justice and the SEC as to how much they should pay in fines, and have the case go away. So most cases don't make it to court. Nevertheless, the U.S. government's collected a lot of money, even notwithstanding. Okay. All right, so let's figure out what the anti-bribery provisions are of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and let's get into it. First of all, in this particular type of law, it only applies to the bribe payer. So let's get this straight. The briber, I guess you want to call it, the briber, the one making the payment, so put that in green, one making the dollars payment, they're the only ones that can be prosecuted. Let's try to unravel why this will be. One of the reasons why is that the bribee, I don't know if that's a word, but it sounds pretty good. The bribee under this law will be Foreign, again, we'll use the FX for that, foreign public government official, public official or government official. And therefore, the United States does not have jurisdiction over foreign government or their foreign government officials. Yes, they may have committed a violation of local law or a sin, if you will. They may certainly have if they've taken a bribe, but the United States does not have jurisdiction that they can charge these particular kinds of people with the crime of being involved in bribery. So the Fcpa only applies to the bribe payer. It's just a one-way street. So if a company makes the bribe, then they could be subject to the fine under the Act. Here are the elements of the law. First of all, the defendant was an issuer. Now we're going to define what that means, and we'll learn a couple things at the same time. First, we'll learn that the issuer means a company that has issued publicly held stock. Let's figure out what the hell this means. There's a lot of business terms here. Publicly held stock. It's called an issuer because they've basically done that. That's where it comes from. They issued stock that has been bought up by the public, and the public is you. Your mutual funds, your savings accounts, your retirement accounts may have invested in the stock market, in the United States stock markets, and when they do that, it's because they issued stock. Now there's another reason why it's sometimes referred to as issuer. Issuer is the terminology for people who have to issuer. There we go. Issuer is often confused. I don't say confused. It's often used to describe someone who has to quote issue financial statements and disclosures to the SEC, so that their company's results of operations and their financial condition is all public knowledge, completely transparent, with stockholders or future stockholders who might become stockholders can see everything they need about making their investment decision in a company that stock is publicly traded on one of these huge markets. So the first part of this is that the defendant is an issuer, which means, let's erase the board here, which basically means that the Fcpa will only apply to public companies. So you see, we're learning a couple things just with this one fact. Only apply to public companies. Now the second thing is, this is going to answer a question from earlier, and that is that it could be that, well, let's even do it with the Brazilian example. The Brazilian company, whatever their name was, let's call it PET, P-E-T, came over to the U.S. and listed their stock on the U.S. stock exchange. The U.S. stock exchange, believe it or not, actually takes and lists on it companies that aren't necessarily United States companies. Perfectly legal to do that. It's an open market, and anybody can come in and pay the fees and live. Well, I was going to say anybody, and you have to have a lot of money. Okay, it's not just anybody, but it's companies that have enough funds where it's worth their while to have their stock traded on one of the strong American markets, best, probably arguably the best in the world. They can pay the freight, abide by the rules, and get their stock listed on the exchanges that exist here. Now, we're going to stop in a second, but I want to answer the question so that we end on a good note, and that is, because these are public companies and the stock markets fall under the jurisdiction of the Department of Justice and the SEC. These are the organizations that administrate and adjudicate the rules and regulations of these markets, and that is how, indeed, a foreign company can become ensnared in defending itself against the U.S. government for a alleged violation of this Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So one more time, because these companies are listing their stock on the U.S. stock exchanges, that is what allows the United States government to prosecute foreign companies that are listed here, or issuers here, if you will. This is what allows the United States government to prosecute what are essentially foreign companies. So they didn't have to list their stock here. That was their choice. Once they did, they accepted the rules and regulations that come with it, and this was one of them. Okay, let's take a break.